Today on Everyday Injustice, we are talking with Bianca Tylek, and she has an exciting new book about to come out in a couple days. Wow. So by the time this program airs, the book will be out. It's called The Prison Industry, How It Works and Who Profits. Let's start just with the title of the book. It sounds sinister. What's kind of the thinking here?
Yeah, absolutely. Sinister is an interesting word. The book is about the prison industry. The prison industry is an $80 billion industry in the United States, built around the incarceration of roughly 2 million people. It's an industry that bleeds sort of wealth out of impacted communities that are disproportionately Black and Brown and low income, as well as from taxpayer coffers, all at the expense of those who are incarcerated. And so this is a book that really, really, really dives deep into what the prison industry is, the history and how it's come about in our country. Who are the major players? How much money is at stake? And what is the impact that this industry has, the harm that it causes? And we tell real stories from impacted folks along the way.
And what's your background?
Absolutely. So my background, I am a former actually investment banker. Spent the first part of my career on Wall Street, and then went to law school. Actually, became an attorney, and then moved into the social justice world, and founded WorthRises back in 2017 with the specific and explicit intention of dismantling the prison industry. I often like to joke that I developed a skill set to build companies that I now use to dismantle them.
Which is really interesting. I mean, it's not the typical background that you normally see in social justice spheres. Why did you decide to kind of dismantle the industry that you started in?
Well, I think that when I was on Wall Street and kind of in the financial services landscape, and I saw how major corporations sort of make their money, I had my sort of antennas up and my feelers out, right, and thinking about it. And then it just, when I saw that particularly applied to the carceral system, it really, really, struck a nerve with me because I think that a lot of times when I started Worth Rises, people would say, well, that feels like, dismantling the prison industry feels like coming up against capitalism. And I'm like, sure, we can say that. But I was like, in fact, there's actually a lot of things you're not allowed to make money doing. And in fact, a lot of people are in prison for them. And our goal is in large way add sort of another reason, another thing that we should not in our society be allowed to make money on. And that is the caging of people. And so that was really sort of where the concept came from and why I decided to sort of shift the energy of my skill set from where it was to this space, and just really saying, like, can we make a difference by actually holding corporations accountable and their government partners, and saying that if you really want a just system, at the very minimum, it can't be based on building wealth for some.
So the phrase follow the money is, I think, kind of overused, following kind of the Watergate, pronouncement. But, can you walk us through why you believe that mass incarceration is actually driven by profit?
Sure. I think mass incarceration is driven by a few things. I think sort of racial capitalism is certainly one of them. And I think the profits based in here. I always say that, like, I think the prison industry or I should say the prison system is in large part wielded for financial interest, but also political interest. We're seeing a lot of that right now in our society, right? And what's going on in the federal government, which is the kind of manipulation of the prison system and the immigration system for the political power, of those who are in elected office right now. Well, I think the same is true of financial interests. There is a lot of people with a financial interest in locking people up. And that comes in a lot of different forms, and forms that I think oftentimes people don't recognize. There's the obvious ones, right? The companies, the private prison companies that lobby for tough on crime laws, or give campaign financing to elected officials or candidates who will pass tough on crime laws, and often are sort of manipulating the narrative towards that end. We know, for example, that Geo Group was the very first corporation to max out on campaign dollars to the Trump administration. They obviously have a lot to gain from the immigration detention policies that this administration would like to put forth. But it gets, deeper than that. It's the construction companies that give campaign dollars to sheriffs who are willing to build new jails, build bigger jails. The vendors, right, that put those folks in, again, give campaign dollars to sheriffs so that they could get those vendor contracts and things of that sort of pretty magnitude size. We've seen bribes even, right, down to like pass the campaign financing into fully illegal sort of territories of corruption, from telecom companies down in Mississippi, and things of that sort. But beyond that, I think there's this, talk about being tired of hearing certain things. I'm always tired of hearing, like, if you do the crime, you should be able to do the time, or whatever that saying goes. And I was always say, like, well, do you know, like, how crimes are determined in our country? And what the sentences are. And so much of that is even driven by corporate, um, sort of corporate maneuvering, right? Take all of the recent, over the last like year or two, sort of organized retail theft conversation, right? And the manipulation of data, and actually just the false data that was put out about the proliferation of organized retail theft. And that was all just simply because a lot of retailers were trying to explain why their brick and mortar sales weren't able to compete with the Amazons of the world. And they were trying to, in many ways shift their security costs from themselves as private entities to the government. And so they were fighting for tougher legislation and sentences for retail theft. And so I think, consistently we need to ask ourselves, who's deciding what's a crime? Who's deciding what crimes get enforced against what people? What sentences are, and all of that, and a lot more than we think. It is industries that are making a lot of those decisions.
So this isn't just a critique of the private prison industry. This is a critique of the entire carceral system.
That's right. The private prison industry is one chapter out of 12. Private prison industry is about a $5 billion industry of the 80 billion I mentioned. So it is one piece of the pie. It is a piece of the pie that often gets spoken about the most. But no, this book is about the entire prison industry. There's a chapter on telecom, a chapter on food services, a chapter on healthcare, data and security, personnel, labor. It is about the really, massive system that exists behind prison bars.
And you talk about this in terms of kind of an extraction that the prison industry is extracting billions of dollars from incarcerated people and their families. Can you kind of explain that?
For sure. So, I think there's a few different ways that companies in this field make money, but there's two primary. One is that the majority of their revenues are driven from incarcerated people and their families, and the other is through taxpayers. And so on the former, you have things like the cost of uh, telephone calls, the cost of commissary, medical co-pays, things of that sort, financial money transfer fees, the kind of, endless list of exorbitant and predatory fees and services that incarcerated people and their families are charged with, to the tune of several $billions, right? And so for many, many years, until just recent, regulations and legislation has been passed in different places in the country, people who were incarcerated were charged as much as $25 for a simple 15-minute phone call. It only changed a few years ago. And even now, people who are incarcerated and their families can still be charged, pretty 10, 15, right, cents a minute to be on a phone call. Um, and so that's pretty, extraordinary, I think, when it comes to like taking money from families. But the same is true of commissary, where we have incredibly inflated prices, in an environment where people make incredibly deflated wages. Right? So those kind of things. So when we say that there's an incredible extraction of wealth happening, it is through, it's from people who are incarcerated and their families who are paying for this service. And I do want to say that, right? Like the average person who's incarcerated makes 14 cents an hour in wages. So oftentimes, if you have to pay 10 cents a minute for a phone call, who is paying for that? Most cases, it's families. And in fact, until recently, 1 in 3 families with an incarcerated loved one is going into debt over the simple cost of trying to stay connected with their loved one. And so it's in those types of ways that we're saying that we're extracting wealth from families. But like I said, it's not just that direct extraction, it's also um, from taxpayer coffers. So if you take healthcare, for example, you have people who are correctional healthcare companies who are getting multi-million and billion-dollar contracts to provide healthcare in a prison or jail. And then in many cases, denying or providing substandard healthcare such that they're being sued repeatedly to the tune of hundreds of times, for medical malpractice and wrongful death and things of that sort. And so while they may not be taking the money straight from the person who's incarcerated or their family member, they're using them and their existence inside of a facility to take taxpayer money for a service that they often don't provide or don't provide at the level that they should. And who suffers but the person in the body, right? That is in that prison or jail. And us as a society long term, because people come home from prison with mortality rates significantly higher than the average person who has not been incarcerated. And those come with, medical costs and social costs for all of us. Um, so, I think in all those different ways is what we mean by this gross extraction of wealth from impacted people and from society at large.
And then your book connects kind of Wall Street and private equity to the prison industry. And so, what role do financial institutions play in this?
Great question. So it's many different roles depending on the sector. There are some companies in certain sectors, like the private prison companies, for example, that are publicly traded. And these publicly traded companies are on the stock market, and anyone can buy sort of a share, right? They trade in that particular way. Then you have sort of what are private equity owned companies. And so, a good example of this space is the telecom space. In the prison telecom space, 90% of the market is owned by 3 private equity firms. H.I.G, which owns ICS, American Securities, which owns Viapath, formerly known as GTL or Global Tel-Link, and then Platinum Equity, which owns Securus, or now also referred to as Eventive. And so all 3 of those private equity firms are deeply invested in the prison industry. In fact, H.I.G owns several prison industry assets, not just the third largest prison telecom company, but owns the largest prison healthcare company, the largest prison commissary company, the second largest prison money transfer company, several, about probably the second or third largest food service company in prisons. And that's a private equity firm down in Miami, Florida, that, ruthlessly sort of moves through this industry in the way that it sort of, extracts that wealth that we were just talking about. And importantly, once private equity is involved, what you know is that this is not a slim margin business. Once you have that many sort of cooks in the kitchen or hands in the cookie jar, right, you need to be turning a pretty significant margin in order to pay all those folks out. Because with a private equity firm, you have all their investors, and their investors can be anywhere, anything from sort of high net worth private individuals or foundations to pensions, insurance, sort of companies, and things of that sort. And so oftentimes we're even looking to those, like, who are these public pensions that are invested in the prison industry? At times, even public pensions that are invested in the very companies that their own jail systems or prison systems contract with. We were able to get one pension to back out of investing with Platinum Equity over its ownership of Securus, in large part because it was a school employee's pension. And it was a lunch lady who wrote a beautiful op-ed in the Philly Inquirer saying, I don't want my retirement funded off the kids that I feed every day, or that's targeting them, right, in these really, really problematic ways, because of their, lack of wealth or low income status and all of that. And so, I think these private equity firms and other type of investors really exacerbate the situation.
And you had earlier mentioned the Trump administration, and I know that that could be a topic for another whole other podcast. But you know, in terms of kind of his projected policies to expand the prison industry, I mean, what do you see as kind of most problematic, most dangerous, or everything?
Most problematic, most dangerous. Well, oh man. There's so much with this one in particular, and the reason I say that is because it's everything from immigration detention to the death penalty. Like, this is the range of things we're dealing with, right? So putting more people behind bars and for longer, like, that is their goal. That's what they aspire to. It's really difficult to, like, watch and to try to prepare for. I think that obviously the immigration detention conversation is largely, dominating in an important way because they're looking to scale the deportation sort of mechanism so extensively that it needs to wildly increase the, amount of people in immigration detention, a number of people in electronic monitoring, and then into deportations. And some of the companies that have been supporting Trump, the private prison companies that are really engaged in this business, have set themselves up in a way to be part of every single step of the deportation cycle. And they are starting to put out their predictions for how many people will be swallowed up in this system, and they're pretty astounding. Where we see today about 185,000 people who are undocumented on electronic monitors, they are forecasting multiples of that, as many as 18 million people to be had on electronic monitors. That is incredible, right? They are talking about a fourfold increase in the number of people in immigration detention from about 40,000 last year to over 160,000 people held in immigration detention. And they're investing in all these things with the intention to wildly, sort of ratchet up their own earnings or revenues and profits. So certainly immigration detention is a massive piece of the equation coming out of the current administration that is problematic. I think, we are seeing death penalty, I think, have a sort of comeback moment where, obviously the administration has talked about um, more people being charged with crimes and that would potentially invoke the death penalty, but also cases where they're trying to move people to other states where they are more likely to be executed. Now we are seeing, the the DOJ sort of instructing more states to charge with different things that would again warrant the death penalty, and more states are passing new ways to kill people. And so we're, for example, bringing a bill in Connecticut that would require the state to revoke or deny a business license to any corporation that seeks to facilitate or engage in the death penalty. And it is taking this type of work to try to prevent some of the harm and damage that's coming out of the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we were watching this week was Luigi facing the death penalty in a case that is really kind of spurious as to whether it's really a federal case. I mean, trying to call that terrorism seems
Right.
pretty far-fetched.
Very much so. Yeah, but like I said, it's like this administration is seeking jurisdiction where others wouldn't, right? Like it wants to move things into its hands.
So, on a more positive note, you outline several policy solutions. Um, I have to say, on a pessimistic note, I don't, you know, I'm not real optimistic in this climate, but maybe things will change. What do you see as kind of achievable solutions now to kind of ease this?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I do think that there's opportunities at different government levels. Like we get very, very consumed by the federal government, right? And the presidential election and everything that the president does. And that's on a normal, in a normal year, we get consumed with federal powers. And then in a year like this, it's even more overwhelming because it's incredibly chaotic and hard to track in some cases and by design. And so there's just a lot of energy, right, being directed towards the federal government. But I think there's still a lot of work that can be done at the state level, at the local level, and even at the federal level. And so I think like that is just a starting point. We are still running, policy campaigns in states and at the local level. And then beyond that, this is a opportunity to do a few other things. I think one, it's an opportunity to educate the masses, as organizations, that is a big part of our work, is to educate people on the situation, on the harm that can happen, and the impact that it has on real people, and really like have people start to understand. And that's a big reason why I'm really glad that we are releasing the prison industry this year in this moment, because if there's nothing else we can do, we can inform a base and outrage a base and engage folks to fight when there feel like there are more openings. And then the last thing I'll say is like there's also always corporate accountability work that can be done. And so, there are interesting, parameters happening now, again, being guided by some of the actions and decisions out of the White House. But one of the companies that we've targeted for the last 5, 6 years is, just weeks probably away from filing for bankruptcy. And so there are opportunities for us to continue to hold those corporations accountable and, outside of the legislative sort of system.
And then finally, and maybe I should have led with this question, but are there stories that you amplify in your book to kind of highlight some of these issues?
Yes. So in every, as I said earlier, every chapter is about a different sector of the prison industry. And in every one of those chapters, we tell the story of somebody who is directly impacted by that sector of the prison industry. In many cases, those are people who are formerly incarcerated. In some cases, those are family members of people who are incarcerated, or they're people who have been on electronic monitors or have other sort of interaction with the carceral system. And we tell the stories in their own voices and their own words. And it's really, really important to, I think, take what, I've heard somebody refer to it as the encyclopedia of corporate greed, but also really pair it with the very human impact that this greed has.
Perfect. I think that's the point we'll end on. We've been talking with Bianca Tylek. Her book is The Prison Industry, How It Works, and Who Profits. It's coming out on April 8th. By the time this episode airs, you'll be able to get it where books are sold. I haven't read it yet, but I will purchase it soon after it comes out. It sounds fascinating and right up the alley of everyday injustice. So thanks for coming on, Bianca.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.